The ball drops and we say, goodbye 80s, hello 90s.
The 1990s, the last decade, when New York still felt real. No social media, no smartphones, no endless gentrification. The city was gritty but alive, chaotic but exciting. You could still find a $2 slice, Times Square had an edge, and hip-hop ruled the streets. It wasn't perfect, crime was still high, the subways were rough, and Times Square was in transition. But somehow, it all worked. People actually lived in the moment. Neighborhoods had their own identity, and New York still had that raw energy you just can't find anymore. Did we take it for granted? Maybe. But today, we're going back. This is what life was really like in 1990s New York. The 1990s marked a pivotal era for New York City, a time when the city retained much of its raw authenticity before the sweeping changes of the new millennium. During this decade, the city's population experienced significant growth, increasing from approximately 7.3 million in 1990 to over 8 million by the year 2000. This population surge was fueled in large part by a substantial influx of immigrants. Throughout the 1990s, New York City welcomed a diverse array of newcomers from countries such as the Dominican Republic, China, Jamaica, and Mexico. By the end of the decade, immigrants constituted a remarkable 35.9% of the city's population, enriching its cultural fabric and reinforcing its identity as a global melting pot. Each neighborhood boasted its own distinct character. The Lower East Side, for instance, was a vibrant enclave of artists, musicians, and family-owned businesses, reflecting the area's rich cultural tapestry. Brooklyn, far from the gentrified borough it would become, was predominantly working class, with neighborhoods like Williamsburg and Bushwick offering affordable housing and fostering tight-knit communities. Times Square, while undergoing a gradual transformation, still retained elements of its edgy past, with neon signs, eclectic shops, and a pulsating street life that was both chaotic and captivating. Life in 1990s New York was markedly different from today. In the absence of smartphones and social media, interactions were face-to-face, and experiences were lived in the moment. Residents relied on paper maps, payphones, and personal connections to navigate the city's complexities. The streets buzzed with a unique energy, a blend of ambition, creativity, and resilience that defined the New York experience during this transformative decade. Reflecting on this period, it's evident that the 1990s were a time when New York City was both gritty and genuine, offering an authenticity that many feel has diminished in the face of modernization and commercialization. Let us now see what the most iconic place in the city was like in those years. The Times Square of the 1990s was a city in transition, not quite the crime-ridden jungle of the 70s and 80s, but not yet the sanitized tourist hotspot it is today. It was still gritty, full of flashing neon signs, independent shops, and the last remnants of its wild past. Walking through Times Square at night, you could still find hole-in-the-wall record stores, massive arcades like Playland, and movie theaters playing double features. It was the era of Tower Records, Virgin Megastore, and Sam Goody places, where you could spend hours flipping through CDs, listening to new music before deciding what to buy. Instead of scrolling through playlists, people actually hung out in these spots, talking to strangers about music and discovering new bands the old-school way. And then there were the arcades. Before home consoles took over, places like Broadway City Arcade and Chinatown Fair were packed with kids and teens dropping quarters into Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and pinball machines. The flashing lights, the sounds of electronic beeps and high scores, the friendly, or not-so-friendly, competition, it was a social experience that just doesn't exist in the same way today. While Times Square was slowly being cleaned up throughout the decade, it still had an edge. Strip clubs, XXX theaters, and sketchy vendors were still around in the early 90s, mixed with the Broadway crowd and late-night food spots. There was a rawness to it, a mix of danger, excitement, and nostalgia that made it unforgettable. Today, Times Square is brighter, safer, and packed with chain restaurants, but does it still have soul? For those who grew up in the 90s, the old Times Square, with its arcades, record stores, and underground energy, was something truly special. Let's continue with something more cheerful: the culture and vibe. of those years. The 1990s were a cultural explosion in New York, where music, fashion, and art thrived in ways that felt raw, rebellious, and completely original. Whether you were into hip-hop, grunge, punk, or underground art, the city had something for everyone. Hip-hop wasn't just music, it was the heartbeat of New York. The streets of Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx gave rise to legends like the Notorious Big, Nas, Wu-Tang Clan, Jay-Z, and Mobb Deep. You could hear boom-bap beats blasting from boomboxes on every block, ciphers happening on street corners, and DJs scratching records in packed clubs. It wasn't just about rap, it was a movement, a voice for the streets, a reflection of the city's struggles and triumphs. At the same time, grunge and alternative rock had their own underground scene. Small venues like CBGB, the Continental, and Brownies hosted raw, high-energy shows with local bands, while places like St. Mark's Place were packed with vintage shops selling flannel shirts, band tees, and Doc Martens. If you were into punk, ska, or hardcore, there was always a show happening somewhere. Graffiti and street art still covered New York before the city cracked down on it in the 2000s. Taggers and muralists like Cope 2 and Cause left their marks on subway trains, alley walls, and rooftops, blending art with rebellion. The city itself was a canvas, and everywhere you looked, you could see a story written in spray paint. The 1990s were the last decade before technology took over our daily lives. No smartphones, no social media, no endless distractions, just the city, the people, and the moment. If you wanted to meet up with friends, you had to set a time and place and actually show up. If you got lost, you asked for directions or figured it out on your own. People actually experienced the city. They weren't walking around staring at screens, they were reading newspapers on the subway, talking to strangers, and looking up at the skyline instead of down at their phones. If you wanted to discover a new restaurant, you didn't check Yelp, you just walked in and tried it. If you wanted to hear new music, you went to a record store or turned on the radio. The way people socialized was completely different. You couldn't just swipe left or DM someone, you had to walk up and start a conversation. Bars, clubs, and coffee shops were packed with people actually talking to each other, not scrolling through Instagram or checking notifications every 5 seconds. And for kids and teenagers, growing up in 90s New York was a completely different experience. You'd spend all day outside, riding bikes, playing basketball at the park, hanging out on the stoop, or just roaming the city. Video games existed, but they didn't dominate. Real life happened in the streets, in arcades, in record stores, and in packed diners at 2 a.m. It's easy to take today's technology for granted, but there was something special about life before the internet. People were more present, more engaged, and more connected to the city around them. New York in the 90s wasn't just a place, it was an experience, one that felt truly free. New York in the 1990s wasn't perfect, crime was still an issue. The city was rough around the edges, and Times Square was in the middle of its transformation. But for many who lived through it, it felt more real, more alive, more unpredictable. Back then, neighborhoods still had their own personality. The Lower East Side wasn't filled with overpriced cocktail bars, it was a mix of punk clubs, vintage shops, and family-owned businesses. Williamsburg wasn't a hipster paradise, it was a working-class neighborhood where rent was cheap and artists could afford to live. There were no luxury high-rises, no $15 avocado toasts, no tech bros taking over every corner of the city. Today, New York is safer, wealthier, and more polished. But has it lost its soul in the process? The mom-and-pop shops have been replaced by chain stores. The underground music venues have shut down. The energy of the streets feels differentless, spontaneous, more controlled. Everything is documented, curated, and filtered for social media. The city still moves fast, but does it still feel the same? What do you think? Was 90s New York better, or do you prefer the city as it is today? Have we lost something in the name of progress? Let us know in the comments. And if you love exploring NYC's past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the city's greatest decades. Until next time, keep the nostalgia alive.